Hello, my name is Randy Hopkins. I appreciate you having me appear on your computer monitor today. This presentation is set in Tulsa in late 1918, shortly before the end of the World War. Before we begin, I need to alert you to something. Most of the historical stories I've written about have horrible endings: kidnappings, torture, a lynching, and of course, the Tulsa Race Massacre. This one's different. This story has a happy ending. In fact, it has 3 happy endings. With that warning out of the way, let's go back to 1918. On October 19th of that year, a headline appeared in the Tulsa Star newspaper titled, "Whites Adopted Slavery Methods." It was accompanied by an article which outlined the efforts of the newspaper's publisher, Andrew J. Smitherman, to free what he described as an elderly, illiterate, colored woman named Mary Johnson from a life of bondage at the hands of a white family in Tulsa. According to the Star, Mrs. Johnson was little more than a slave, performing every manner of work, including mowing the yard, for the promise of $2 a week, often unpaid. She slept on the attic floor, was forbidden to associate with others of her race, and was reported to have been whipped at least once when she was found with other colored women from the neighborhood. This group later stormed into the offices of the Star to demand help, and help they got, as will be seen. In response to the article, a group called the Tulsa Council of Defense summoned Smitherman to appear before it and explain himself. Smitherman did not duck the summons. Coverage of the resulting behind-closed-doors hearing, however, in 2 white-owned newspapers, claimed that Smitherman had quickly folded, admitting that the Tulsa Star article was untrue and without any foundation. And that's how the story ended in the white newspapers of the day. So, what really happened? First, who were these people? Andrew J. Smitherman is no doubt familiar to many of you. Here's his picture from later in life. He moved to Tulsa in 1913 to found the Tulsa Star, a crusading newspaper whose existence was snuffed out on June 1, 1921, during the Tulsa Race Massacre, which also permanently exiled Smitherman from the town he had grown to love. In addition to promoting the interest of his fellow black people, Smitherman was a resolute fair player for all people. He explained his philosophy as follows: "Justice and fair play for all men is the policy pursued by the Star. We ask no special favors for members of our group, but as citizens, we demand them in common with all men. We demand all that the Constitution and American citizenship entitles them to, nothing more and nothing less." What about the Council of Defense? It was a wartime creature of this man, then Oklahoma Governor Robert Lee Williams. Without any legal basis to do so, that much was admitted at the time, the self-styled war governor established a state council of defense augmented by 77 county councils, of which the Tulsa Council of Defense was the most aggressive and repressive. The state council's official history bragged that the county councils were the supreme law in the land during the war. Seeking to mobilize the resources of Oklahoma for war, the first target was Oklahomans themselves. Said to be deaf to the war trumpets, the council's premier goal was to whip the state citizens into a frenzy. It was not enough to eradicate dissent. It was a war on lukewarmism itself. The very structure of the Council of Defense was designed for this purpose. Williams, who handpicked all the members, prescribed that the county councils should consist of the top banker, the top newspaper man, and the top lawyer in each county. The bankers were to help with the money. These were not government operations, and there was no public funding involved. By including the top newspaperman, Williams assured that the newspapers, which were the mass media of the day in the days even before commercial radio, would be reporting according to the desired agenda. In Tulsa, the top banker designee was Robert McFarland. In 1916, McFarland and his partners had sold their company to Standard Oil for the current equivalent of many billions of dollars. McFarland used this largesse to manage public affairs during the war. McFarland was also director and vice president of the Exchange National Bank, which was Tulsa's largest bank, as well as the state's largest, residing in the tallest building in the state, and was said to be the largest oilman's bank in the world. The bank later became the National Bank of Tulsa, and later still the Bank of Oklahoma. McFarland funded the Council of Defense's many activities, including the formation of a private paramilitary force called the Home Guard, said to be able to spring into action at a moment's notice. McFarland's donations would later be refunded to him. He was, after all, a banker. The top newspaperman was the managing editor of the Tulsa Daily World, Glenn Condon, who also became the council's first publicity director. The Tulsa Daily World, owned by Eugene Lorton, was intimately and financially connected with the Exchange National Bank. Bank director and vice president Harry Sinclair was the newspaper's financial angel, and his brother was the bank president. The Tulsa Daily World's reportage, and especially its editorial policy, was coordinated with the county council. To this day, the Tulsa Council of Defense's actions throw a dark shadow across Tulsa's history. To promote war hysteria, for example, the Tulsa World's editorial page routinely bugled for vigilante violence, including lynching, to be directed against domestic enemies, conveniently centered on unions seeking to organize in the oil fields. Repeated incitements to murder became a routine feature of the paper's editorials, printed right next to the name of the paper's owner and editor. When one wonders how the horrors of the Tulsa Race Massacre could occur in such a sophisticated city, one reason, among many, is that Tulsans had long been encouraged in the use of vigilante violence against their enemies. These incitements came not from the dregs of society, but from the top, from the pinnacle of power. Elements of the council's home guard also reappeared during the race massacre. In the aftermath, eyewitness Mary E. Jones Parrish wrote that denunciation of the remustered home guard was on every lip in Greenwood. This then was the nature of the organization that Andrew Smitherman ran up against in late 1918. At the outset of the war, however, Smitherman and the Tulsa Council were not at loggerheads. In fact, the Tulsa Council originally established a colored home guard, though it was to be strictly limited to 50 men and their jurisdiction was limited to the colored section. Smitherman himself was originally the number 2 man in this guard, the first lieutenant, and his brother John was the quartermaster. Later, after relations between the council and Smitherman soured, the council's official history proclaimed that the colored home guard was never mustered. Perhaps not, but Andrew Smitherman mustered himself. On Friday, October 18th, the group of race women who worked for white people in South Tulsa called upon the editor indignantly to protest the treatment of an old woman at the hands of the family of Charles H. Kretz, K-R-E-T-Z, Kretz. Andrew enlisted his brother John, the Tulsa Police Department's first black detective, or plainclothesman, and on Saturday afternoon, October the 19th, the two set off across the tracks to the Kretz house at 716 South Denver. They were told that Mrs. Johnson was not there. One imagines the door being slammed in their face. So they went to the police department. And do you know what the 1918 Tulsa Police Department did? They helped them out. And not just because John Smitherman was himself a police officer. They didn't assign some lowly police officer to help, but the chief of detectives, John's boss. And the three set off again for the scene of the investigation. It is not surprising that the city police would help Smitherman in 1918, and not simply because John Smitherman was himself a cop. The police department was a wholly different operation in those days. Then, whenever a new city administration took over, they were free to fire some or even all of the existing police officers and replace them with their own men. After that, they could hire and fire at will. As a result, the police and the police operations could change like the seasons. In the spring of 1918, Tulsa City voters had turned out of office the incumbent Republican administration and elected the Democrats under Charles Hubbard. Mr. Smitherman had thrown the full weight of his paper behind the election of the Democratic Party ticket. Smitherman had condemned the Republicans as the aristocratic bunch who had conducted a reign of terror and rottenness, much of it directed against the black community of Greenwood. So, when Smitherman came calling on the police department in late 1918, the police listened. Gaining access to the Kretz house, Mrs. Johnson was soon located. She explained her plight and that she wanted to quit but was afraid of the Kretz family. Mrs. Kretz protested mightily, bewailing that all was well until some nigger women came here to see Mary. The Kretz's teenage daughter uttered the immortal words, "The damn Yankees were the cause of all of this." The Kretzes were from southern Louisiana. Mrs. Kretz called her husband, urging him to come as, she said, some nigger men were here after Mary. The angry Charles Kretz soon arrived and, with what was called commanding voice and flashing eyes, demanded they leave. Chief Detective Pilkington calmly replied that working a woman for the ridiculous sum of $2 a week against her will was against the law, and that a few more words from Kretz, unless requested, would result in his arrest. Kretz then turned his outrage to the Smithermans, referring to them with the usual unpleasantries. Andrew wrote that he had to hold his brother John off the cowardly Hun, for Smitherman had concluded that Kretz was pro-German and described him by the anti-German slur of the day. It is likely that Kretz spoke with an accent. Just then, a new actor arrived on the scene, Tulsa County Judge William B. Williams. Smitherman describes Williams as simply happening along as if he had been strolling in the neighborhood 1.3 miles from his house. Right. The two knew each other from Democratic Party politics. The newspaperman had more allies than simply the police. After a brief chat with Smitherman, Judge Williams entered the house and proved a quick study. Addressing the infuriated Charles Kretz, Williams ruled, "Now see here, my man, don't you get too gay." The word meant differently in those days. "I'm judge of this county, and these colored men are good citizens. I'll have you sent to jail in 2 minutes. Don't you know that slave days are over? You can't work colored people or white people in this country without paying them a fair wage. These men are here after this woman, and they're going to take her. And by the eternal gods, "We'll take you if you're not careful." Kretz is not recorded as having made a reply. Mary Johnson was removed, first to the Smitherman house and then to the care of her own family. Happy ending number 1. A few days later, Smitherman enthusiastically endorsed Judge Williams, who was running for re-election, writing that as state representative, assistant county attorney, and now county judge, Williams has, quote, "always been sincere and conscientious in the discharge of his duties and equally bold and outspoken in his stand for even-handed justice for all." He was another fair player. In November 1918, Williams handily won re-election. Smitherman's continued support for Williams was even more vital during the 1920 election. Then, Judge Williams resisted a Republican landslide behind Warren G. Harding to win a narrow 107-vote victory. In the spring of 1921, Williams was elevated to the state district bench by then-Governor Robertson. And in August of 1921, he was the presiding judge on a 3-judge panel which ruled on the City Commission's new zoning ordinance, which sought to prevent the rebuilding of Greenwood. Late on the evening of September 1, 1921, Williams announced the decision of the court throwing out the zoning ordinance and ending that attempt at ethnically cleansing Greenwood. Happy ending number 2. As you have probably realized from the fact that you're listening to this, Charles Kretz was no Hun, at least not in the way the word was used at the time. He was, in fact, a respected member of the Tulsa establishment. He was the general manager of the Public Service Company, which operated a generating station on Cheyenne near First. In that capacity, Kretz was almost certainly involved in the 1917 scheme involving the so-called Better Citizens and the Council of Defense to install a riot signal at the public service plant, whereby Tulsa could become a bristling arsenal at a moment's notice. The plan being that upon hearing this whistle, citizens and their guns should descend on downtown Tulsa. The whistle, later upgraded so that it could be heard 20 miles away, is the leading candidate for the source of the whistle or horn that was sounded at dawn on Wednesday, June 1, 1921, that launched the invasion of Greenwood. Kretz was also the number 2 man and secretary of the Draft Exemption Board, which ruled on appeals of those contending they were exempt from the military draft, which was then used to provide human fodder for the war. That is probably how the Tulsa Council of Defense got involved. Kretz's photo that you saw earlier is drawn from the official history of the Tulsa Council of Defense. Right next to his picture is a picture of the chairman of the Exemption Board, Harry H. Rogers. Rogers was the right-hand man and consigliere of this man, Robert McFarland, who was the vice president of the Tulsa Council of Defense. So, shortly after, Smitherman publicized the Kretz affair and Mary Johnson's liberation, he was called on the carpet to explain himself before the Tulsa Council of Defense. Not one to duck, Smitherman had no hesitancy in showing up. But the hearing could not have been an easy one. For one thing, Smitherman had wrong-footed himself by labeling Kretz a pro-German and a Hun. Smitherman was also forced to confront a particular foe of his. By late 1918, the Tulsa Council of Defense's chief lawyer and self-described prosecutor was this man, John Meserve. Meserve was the prosecutor of a long series of secret investigations and secret trials of the disloyal, or those, like Smitherman, who had crossed the council. According to the Tulsa Council's official history, this included sending many of the targets to an insane asylum. They simply, by their own admission, disappeared their enemies. This practice had riled Smitherman, who took to referring to the council as the Star Chamber, a Star Chamber being a secret and discriminatory judicial proceeding. Smitherman targeted Meserve in particular, calling him a dictator and ridiculing him on the front page of the paper. And now Smitherman was a Star Chamber defendant. The hearing must have been a dramatic one. Mary E. Jones Parrish gathered some information from her interviews after the race massacre, writing that Smitherman was charged with being dangerous to the peace and security of our county and was threatened with the confiscation of his newspaper's plant. She said he was denied counsel and quoted one of Smitherman's supporters on the council that, quote, only Smitherman's nerve and manliness saved him. The membership of the council had grown by the end of the war as other members, elite members of society, climbed on board. The most likely candidate of Smitherman's support, referred to by Jones, is Mayor Charles Hubbard, who had joined the committee. Given Jones's tantalizing description, I would love to be able to describe the hearing in detail. I should be able to tell you exactly who was there and what was said. The Tulsa Council of Defense was a bureaucratic organization given to record keeping. Of its secret investigations, the council bragged about the voluminous files and reports of its strict and searching investigations, which would be an astonishing revelation if revealed to the citizens. But those records have vanished. What is notable is the presence of significant Oklahoma historians and the failure to preserve this history. At war's end, the Tulsa Council of Defense renamed itself the Tulsa County Historical Society. That's right. The first Tulsa County Historical Society was the Council of Defense. One expressed goal was to preserve the records and files relating to the great events of history and to assure that its own records would not be lost. Robert McFarland was an original incorporator and director, but the Society's first president was John Meserve. Later, Meserve served as director of the Oklahoma Historical Society for 8 years and authored 34 deeply researched historical articles for the Chronicles of Oklahoma. Meserve knew how to preserve historical records. If you visit the Oklahoma Historical Society's Research Center today, you will find volumes of documents preserved and presented by Meserve, which constitute the backbone of his historical research. Yet, after hiring the publicity director of the State Council of Defense to write an official history of the Tulsa Council, the actual records were allowed to disappear. If any of you have them, please let me know. The situation is not much better regarding the records of the State Council of Defense, and again, a noted Oklahoma historian is involved, namely Oklahoma Governor Robert Lee Williams. Williams was something of a godfather of the Oklahoma Historical Society, having been directly responsible for the construction of the original society headquarters, one that exceeded the domeless state capitol in terms of augustness. Williams was directly responsible for founding the Chronicles of Oklahoma, the Society's wonderful quarterly journal, which is celebrating its 100th anniversary this year and is currently in the process of going online. Williams was a board member of the Society from 1915 to 1948, its president for 10 years, and was said by his biographer, Edward E. Dale, to have dominated the board and the organization. Without Williams, the study of Oklahoma history would not be where it is today. If you visit the Research Center, you can examine 48 packed files from the Williams collection that was presented to the Society. Yet, this is the State Council of Defense collection delivered to the Historical Society. One tiny file, representing the peak of Williams' personal political power. There are some documents regarding the State Council at the State Archives, but the actual archives and records of the State Council itself are not there. The Tulsa Council's official history ignores the Smitherman affair, which is telling. The official history lists every act for which the council took pride, ranging from secret manhunts, guarding the detention camp, delivering forced labor to war factories, making sure patriotic sermons were given in church, and forbidding the sale and use of firearms. There is no mention of Andrew Smitherman. We do have the Tulsa Daily World's back page article reporting that Smitherman was called on the carpet and lectured. Another paper, the Tulsa Morning Times, whose editor was then on the Council of Defense, wrote that Smitherman admitted that his slavery article was untrue and without any foundation. Stung into action, Smitherman responded with a new article titled "A False Statement Nailed," asserting that the Times report was absolutely untrue. As for Kretz, Smitherman wrote that, "When I wrote that article, gentlemen, I believed just what I wrote, but if I was mistaken, I'm as glad of it as you are." It is likely that this admission had been enlarged in the press reports. Otherwise, Smitherman refused to turn tail and run, and he leaves us with this. We do not think it disloyal to oppose injustice and mistreatment of our people, or any other people for that matter, and in defense of this principle, we will be found on the firing line as usual. No man's position will influence us or deter us in our policy of fighting for even-handed justice. From what I know of Andrew Smitherman's life, he could say the same thing at the end of that life with a straight face. Happy ending number 3. Thank you for listening.
All right. Thank you, Randy. That was a very great and interesting presentation that you gave. We do have several questions that I want to get started with. Randy?
Yes,
All
here
right.
we go. All right.
All right. Gina asks, can you describe how the war bond slackard list played into the powerful white leadership?
There was a tremendous, what I referred to as the war against lukewarmism. And slackers was the pejorative used not just for people who didn't buy the Liberty bonds, but who weren't fully enthusiastic about the war. And they would, for example, threaten to publish people who hadn't bought bonds or were deemed slackers. Yeah, the slacker was the anti-slacker campaign was a big deal. For example, in 1918, they had a giant slacker raid in downtown Tulsa, where the Home Guard, whose picture you saw, rounded up over 2,000 people who couldn't show a draft card, and in some cases held them overnight. So slackerism was a big meme.
Dell asked, is there some more links that the individuals and leadership of the Council of Defense in World War I were involved in the race massacre 3 years later? Or was it primarily this climate that persisted those years later?
Well, it was both. The Home Guard, which had been commanded in 1918 by LJF Rooney, who turned out also to be in charge of the Tulsa National Guard during the race massacre. And that may have facilitated the remustering and reappearance of the Home Guard itself, which Mary E. Jones Parrish and many of her witnesses talk about reassembling for the then called race riot, and playing a devious role in that in terms of luring people out of their houses before they could be burned. Individuals who show up, Buck Lewis, who was the Tulsa representative on the State Guard, a lieutenant colonel on Williams' staff, and an ex officio member who made recommendations to appoint people to the Tulsa Council of Defense, reappears certainly in the aftermath of the race massacre as the chairman of Evans' Reconstruction Committee that was centered around the zoning ordinance business. Tate Brady, who of course many people are aware of in connection with the race massacre, was very likely a secret, as they called it, a secret representative or member of the Tulsa Council of Defense. So it was more than simply the education process that was given to Tulsa citizens. There were people and institutions involved in both ends.
Great. Dexter asks, is there more information on R.L. Williams and his white supremacy?
I got it right here. You want to know about that? Robert, it's called Pioneer Judge, The Life of Robert Lee Williams. It was co-authored by Edward Everett Dale, the longtime head of the history department at the University of Oklahoma, and James Morrison, the Southeastern Oklahoma department head, both of whom knew Williams very well. And what you want to know about Williams, that's the place to start. Pioneer Judge.
Shelby was very impressed by your using several sources, and she wanted to know, how can researchers become more effective in constructing compelling narratives like you did?
Well, I think efficiency helps. I try to be efficient and not try to waste words. And so, because I've sat through, a number of lectures in my life that kind of grind on and on and on. So I try to get right to the point and make every sentence count.
She also asks, today we have the Federal Freedom of Information Act and the State Open Records Acts. Are stories like the one involving the Council of Defense, you mentioned perhaps some of the reasons that motivated people to call for more transparency in government?
Yeah, I think so. What I found out is that there's a lot of evidence out there that hasn't been evaluated. There's a lot of evidence that hasn't been discovered. So I don't think anyone should think that the whole story has been told.
Scott wants to know, when did the Council of Defense end and how?
At the end of the war in January of 1919, the state council sent out orders to the county councils to wrap their business up. And that's when the Tulsa Council of Defense met and changed themselves into the Tulsa County Historical Society.
Honor wants to know more about what you mentioned in your session about the moves to suppress individuals was to declare them insane and send them to asylums. Could you speak more about this?
Well, I haven't been able to run any details down. It is likely that the asylum used was the one in Veneta. And Governor Robert Lee Williams, in 1915 or 16, there was something called the Oklahoma Lunacy Act, believe it or not, that was passed by the legislature establishing or promoting these asylums. And Williams, as governor, got to functionally appoint the heads of the asylums. So if someone did get sent to Veneta because they crossed wires, he was, or she, I guess they were all he's, were shipped off to the warden appointed by the governor.
Brett wants to know if you can comment on the Tulsa outrage involving the Home Guard and the alleged Wobblies.
Yes, I can talk about it a great deal. But the best way to find that out is in the Chronicles of Oklahoma. The winter 2019 and 20 book with the airplane on it has my article, Birthday of the Klan, the Tulsa Outrage of 1917. And I go to it in great detail because I think these three events, the Tulsa Outrage, the lynching of Belton in 1920, and then the race massacre, were like Beethoven's three opening notes.
Dexter wants to know more about what happened to Meserve after his time with the Oklahoma Historical Society.
Well, he joined the Historical Society, I think, after he retired from the practice of law. He had largely dropped out from the front page of the papers after his term as city attorney and his role with the Tulsa Council of Defense, although he was the first president of the Tulsa County Historical Society. And then he went back to the practice of law.
Can you tell me how rare it was for someone like Smitherman at that time, 1918, to be a Democrat when most African Americans were Republicans?
It's a great question, and I wish I could quantify it. But Smitherman almost seems to be the cutting edge on the transfer of allegiances from the Republicans to the Democrats. And Smitherman recognized the leverage involved in this. Instead of just blindly going with the Republicans who had already betrayed them during the state constitutional convention, there was advantage to be had from becoming a Democrat. And if you look at Smitherman, he arrived in 1913 in Tulsa with nothing. 5 years later, he could engage in a controversy and have the support of the white mayor, the white police department, the white county judge, and the county commissioners had appointed him justice of the peace. So that was probably a pretty powerful lesson given to people to the advantages of opening up to alternatives.
JT wants to know, given the limited records remaining and the apparently intentional efforts to cover up this history, how did you piece this story together?
Well, fortunately, both the Tulsa Council and the State Council wrote official histories, and these things are very incriminating. I'm sure everybody's seen it in their own historical research where people are writing oblivious to how it will look 100 years later. So that was a tremendous advantage. And beyond that, it just took a lot of time looking at the files. There are wonderful files at the state archives and the Oklahoma Department of Library. There are archives in Tulsa. It just required.
And I'm sure a lot of it came from the Tulsa Star itself.
Yes, especially on this part. I didn't start this particular presentation with Smitherman. I was researching the Tulsa Council of Defense, and I saw one little blurb that they were taking on Smitherman, so I knew it was going to be a great story.
Were the councils of defenses in other Oklahoma counties similar to the Tulsa one, tinged with this kind of racism?
Yes, but many counties didn't take it as serious. Tulsa was really, they were wired into it. Another council of defense that was particularly egregious was Pontotoc County, which is where the Green Corn Rebellion supposedly occurred. So, and at one point, the Tulsa ringleaders were actually asked to take over the state council to try to pump it up.
Are another question that just came in from Holly is, did any of these other councils of defenses ever work together?
I don't see a lot of direct evidence of that, but as I say, the head of the Tulsa Council, who was named Burr Gibbons, sort of the father of advertising in Tulsa, was responsible for giving recommendations to the other councils. So if anything, the Tulsa Council again took the lead in all of this, but no one other than Pontotoc. I mean, there are a lot of examples of tar and featherings and other things, but it was really systematic in Tulsa.
James asked, well, at first he's sorry that he missed the beginning of the presentation, but he asked if that you mentioned Glenn Condon. Did you find much active participation in the council by him?
Oh, yes. He was at the first meeting that elected the director of publicity. So he was the one that presented the face of these things. And he was deeply involved in the Tulsa World editorial campaign with these flagrant instigations of murder. In fact, there is some change. He left the Tulsa World in very late November of 1918, and there is definitely a change in the editorial tone with his departure.
Marvin wants to know where the Tulsa County Council of Defense was involved in the near lynching of Henry Reimer at Collinsville in 1918, who was a Mennonite. Do you have any information on that?
No, but another council of defense was Rogers County, I think, which is where Collinsville was then. I think it changed to Tulsa County later on, but that was a Rogers County thing. And frankly, that whole thing looked, I'm not sure the victim was in on it, but at the critical moment, just before they were lynching the guy, the police arrive and talk him into letting the Rogers County Council of Defense try the fellow.
Shelby wants to know, in light of our current challenges, pandemic, racial reckoning, 24 hours news media, and social media, what lessons for today do you think this story brings us?
Well, I tell you one thing, it's actually a lot easier to research history back then because the mass media of the day were the daily newspapers. And of course, now you have this deluge. So I don't think I'd like to be a historian 100 years from now trying to paste all this together.
Matt wants to know if the councils were quasi-legal arms of the KKK.
Well, they were not legal arms of anybody. There was no legal power. These were completely extralegal. They bragged about it. Both the state council and the Tulsa council bragged about it. I don't think so, because I think my view from my review is that the Klan really got fertilized by the race massacre, as opposed to already being there to cause these events. But they were fertilized by the outrage. Black-clad highwaymen kidnapping people, tarring and feathering them, the 1920 lynching, all of these just, they told people what to expect.
JT wants to know if you are working on other projects or publishing anything else anywhere right now. Well,
yes, as a matter of fact, today I have an article that's going online at an organization called the Center for Public Secrets.org. It's a Tulsa history museum that have agreed to publish my papers. And the one that's going online today is called The Mask of Atonement. It is a very short article. Anybody will be happy to know. And it's about the second full day of coverage of the Tulsa Race Massacre. The first day of national coverage was the disaster itself, but the critical second day put it in context for readers all over the country. And Mask of Atonement is my study of how the Tulsa Chamber of Commerce was able to control and manage the news of that day. So if you go to centerforpublicsecrets.org, you can find all my writings. And if you want another plug, the brand new Chronicles of Oklahoma has my article on the Belton lynching, Racing to the Precipice, Tulsa's Last Lynching. And hopefully it will stay the last lynching.
Yes. We have time for one more question. Can you expand on what happened to Smitherman after your presentation?
Well, he I'm not I don't call myself an expert on his subsequent life, but he was driven into exile. He ended up in New York, near Buffalo, where he founded a number of newspapers and continued to write for the rest of his life. I will add that I understand that the Smitherman family is planning to publish his biography, which was also published in the Buffalo newspaper, which I'm not have access to. So I'm hopeful that we'll find a lot more information about him if that's published. So I encourage them to do so.
That's great. Well, thanks for this very interesting session, Randy.
Okay.
I can
Thank
tell
you.
everybody really appreciated it. Thank you.